Hey guys, Mr. Morgan here with another remote learning instructional video. I'm going to try and keep this one fairly short today. So what we are doing today is we are going to go through our Chapter 3, Section 2, which is history. We're going to do the timeline today. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So the first thing we have is our instructions for the timeline. So we will be creating a timeline for North Africa. That's Chapter 3. What you will do is add the date and the name of the event for each bullet point on the PowerPoint. Make sure that we only do the bullet points. We don't need to do all the extra stuff. So what we're then going to do once we have added the date and the name of the event is we will draw the lines for each bullet point the best you can. I don't expect it to be perfect because we are doing it freehand, or either if you're remote learning, you will be doing it on a on your iPad, or if you want to, you can try and copy this down on a piece of paper if you think that might be easier. So the final slide is going to show an example of what our timeline should look like. So let's go ahead and get started on our timeline. So we're going to skip all of ancient Egypt because we already covered ancient Egypt. So Egypt would previously be conquered by the Persians and the Greeks. That is what we had talked about before. The Persians conquered ancient Egypt, and then we see Alexander the Great would conquer ancient Egypt. So we have two things relating to this more ancient Egypt side of Egyptian and North African history. The first thing we have is around 800 BC. Reminder that BC means before Common Era, so think of it like a negative number. So it's not uh, 1,200 years ago. It's 2,800 years ago. So 800 BC, like a negative number, negative 800. Phoenicians, or ancient Greeks, build the city of Carthage in Tunisia. So the next thing that we have is Cleopatra. So Cleopatra, or as her full name would be, Queen Cleopatra VII, was the last great Greek ruler of Egypt around 51 BC to around 10 or 12 BC. It's debated when she actually stopped ruling over ancient Egypt, but that about 20 some years is when she was in charge of Egypt. So afterwards, we're skipping forward to about 400 AD. This is the first line we're going to actually have on the timeline. The other two you can put as arrows pointing to way back when, and then kind of just put the number 800 and the number 51, and then make sure that you put BC there so that we know that they're a really long time ago. So in 400 AD, we have most of the North Africans convert to Christianity. This is due to the Greeks and Romans coming into control. So after Cleopatra would leave, we would have the Roman Empire coming and taking over the area. So this is when we see outside groups start to really control the area and make some big changes. The first of which we're going to have is religion. So moving on to our next part, we see another religion coming in, which is Islam. So we had 400 AD, or just 400. Our next date is 600. So in the year 600, we see the religion of Islam is first preached in Africa. This is the first time that it starts to come into the area. Before then, it would start to trickle in with traders, but we see it being preached and taught and spread more in the area around 600. The reason we see this is because of the Arab Empire. So starting in modern day Saudi Arabia, which is incredibly close to North Africa, it's actually where right next to where we see Africa and Asia sharing a border. It's the next section we're going to talk about after we talk about Africa, moving on to the Middle East and the Arab Empire. So the Arab Empire would expand around 600 to around 800. We would see it exist, and it would have these massive expansions into North Africa and then further into Asia. So it takes over pretty much all of North Africa, as we see, and during this time, North Africa becomes part of the Arab Empire, and we see a lot of things spread, like religion, language, and different cultural practices, like architecture, for example. So after a while, we see trade and expansion of the Arab Empire, and we see a mass Arab migration to North Africa in the 11th century, which is about 1000 to 1100 AD. AD, so 1000 to 1100, that 100 years, we see a massive migration of people from the Arab Empire to North Africa, and they would stay permanently, and they would be known as the people in North Africa. We would see that this group of people would take over the cultural identity of the North Africans. So our last thing is, for this slide at least, is the Trans-Saharan caravan route. So this is the trade between North Africa and then through the Sahara towards places along like West and Central Africa, and then even some further into Eastern Africa, and some down towards Southern Africa. So this would be connecting Northern Africa with the rest of Africa, and we would see this trade route exist and thrive from around 800 to 1700. So this very long time, we see the Trans-Saharan caravan route and trade route exist. We would see a lot of different things come from this. So cultural exchange, trading different goods and ideas between the two. We would see Mansa Musa in this time period. Another thing that we would see is things like the slave trade would exist partially because of this. They would use the Trans-Saharan caravan routes and the trade routes in order to travel towards places in Northern Africa and take slaves and use those trade routes to get to the Slave Coast and the Gold Coast in Western Africa. So after around 1700, not long after we see the caravan trade routes start to end, we would see European rule of Northern Africa. So this starts around 1800s. There would be a lot of Europeans in the area. They would take control of a lot of places and have the slave trade, but we would see them really take control in 1800. This is around the time that we have European powers just completely occupy all of Africa. And so we see a couple of different groups in this area. So you don't need to write this part down, but the Europeans that would control North Africa in the 1800s, we would have Britain controlling Egypt and the Suez Canal, Italy controlling Libya, and then the Spanish controlling Western Sahara, and then a small part of Morocco. The remainder would belong to the French. So the French would control the rest of North Africa. So this would be the countries of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. All of those would be controlled by the French, which is why if you read about Morocco, it's often called during World War II French Morocco, because during World War II, a lot of the French would flee Paris after it gets captured, and they would go to Morocco. So we see during the occupation of places in Europe, a lot of these Europeans come to these areas. So this would exist for a couple hundred years, about 120 or so years. And then we have around the 1950s, after World War II, we see a lot of these Europeans leave, and we see most areas in the region would gain independence. So these are trends that we see just about in every part of Africa. 1800s, Europeans control parts of Africa, and then they leave after World War II around the 1950s, and then 1950s to 60s and 70s, we see them gain independence and fight for independence. This isn't any different. Not all of Northern Africa would gain independence in the 1950s. Some would gain earlier, which we're going to talk about later, and others would have to struggle and fight for that independence, like, for example, Algeria. So a lot of people in places didn't want to give up independence. Like example, Tunisia did not want to give up independence, and so they tried to hold on for as long as they can. Other places we see things like the French not wanting to give up control of the country or the region in order to try and maintain trade relations or cheaper labor. And so we see, for example, in Algeria, starting in 1954, they have to start fighting for independence, which is why we see this massive, bloody, incredibly gruesome war in Algeria against the French for independence, which they would ultimately win and gain control of their own country in 1962. So moving on to our last slide, we have Egypt. Egypt would gain independence Uh, Technically, they would gain independence in 1922 when Egypt formally is released from Great Britain. However, Great Britain would quietly control a lot of the country, um, things like the Suez Canal and a lot of major trade routes along the Nile River, and major coastal cities and places like Cairo would stay controlled by the British because they were so populated and they were so good at making money. The Suez Canal, we've talked, is incredibly important for Egypt as it brings in a lot of money. However, whoever controls Egypt controls the Suez Canal, and so Great Britain obviously didn't want to let go of the Suez Canal after World War II. Um, and even after World War I, we see that Great Britain needed the money because war is very expensive, and so they did not want to let go of the Suez Canal, and Egypt would quietly remain under British rule until about 1952, when we see President Nasser uh, would seize control of Egypt. Nasser would be a a form of a dictator in the area. He would call himself president, but he would still be a dictator, and he would, through using military leaders, he would gain control of the country, fight off and kick out the British, and then over the next couple of years, he would slowly gain control of the rest of Egypt. In 1956, Nasser would control the Suez Canal for Egypt, which is kind of the highlight of his reign and his control and his time as president, gaining the Suez Canal. This was incredibly important for Egypt as it brought in a lot of money. However, it was not without a lot of backlash, and we see a lot of international arguments over controlling the Suez Canal. Another thing is that the Suez Canal would bring in a lot of money, but a part of it would uh, eventually backfire, which we're going to talk about later, would backfire for Egypt, and they would lose control of it from time to time. So the next thing that we have, and the final thing that we have for Egypt, is them fighting with Israel. So a lot of their more modern history, more contemporary history, after them gaining independence, is about them fighting with Israel. So from 1967 to 1979, we see three different arguments between the two countries, Egypt and Israel. Egypt incredibly large, Israel incredibly small. So we see a lot of fighting between these two countries over the Sinai Peninsula. When we talk about the Middle East and we talk about Israel, we're going to talk about that a lot more and get into more detail on it. But for right now, all we need to know is that there is fighting between Egypt and Israel over this area. So Egypt has a lot of important control points like the Nile River, the Suez Canal, the largest cities in Africa, and then also the Sinai Peninsula, which holds more of a cultural, religious sort of value more than anything else. It's not super significant when it comes to like a important trade route, but it is more important for those two cultures, and these things date back towards even like biblical times. When we talk about all that later next semester, we're going to see a lot of those things. So here is our sort of what your timeline should look like. There are 14 different boxes for you to fill in, and there are 14 things that we talked about, 14 bullet points that we covered in this PowerPoint. I believe that is it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. As always, I will be available on Zoom from 3:30 to 5. If you want to join a little bit early to ask me a question, feel free to do that. If you need to stay a little bit later because we're talking about something, feel free to do that. This will be due in the next couple of days. I don't have a specific due date for it. It really shouldn't take you all that long to complete. We normally finish these in one class period. So I will post a due date for that later. Make sure, if you haven't already, you do the Sahara Desert Travel Guide. That is due tomorrow, I believe. Yes, it is due tomorrow. So I think that is it. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know how I can help you guys out. I will see you guys as soon as I can. Let's see. I think that's it. Have a nice day. I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.